All right.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Reverend Charisma Jean Marie, and I serve as the Director for Racial Justice Ministries at Scarritt Bennett Center. And I am so glad that you're with us tonight as we launch our new series, Women of Color Who Are Writing. And so I'm grateful for our first guest this evening, Sandhya Jha, who's here with us. But before we get there, let me introduce you to part of the RJM team, Anna Massey, who is our marketing manager. Anna will be managing the question and answer section later on this evening. So if you have any questions or comments, we invite you to share in the comment sections of our posts, our Facebook Live posts. We welcome your questions. We welcome your comments in this space. This is sacred space. And so we welcome all to join in this conversation, a great conversation I'm really excited about this evening. While difference of opinion and perspective are welcome, difference does not mean hate or disrespect. And so if we see any comments or questions that are disrespectful, does that reflect the sacred space that we like to offer here, we will delete them immediately. So thank you, Anna, for joining us, and we will bring you back later on this evening. It is my great honor to introduce to some and welcome others, Sandhya Jha, who is in Oakland, California, author. She is a freedom fighter. She is in the streets doing a whole lot of amazing work. And so thank you so much for accepting this invitation this evening to be with us, Sandhya.
Absolutely.
I want to invite you, if you will, if you would just share a little bit about you. We want to know about you. Tell us a little bit about you, where you grew up, your family members. Tell us who's Sandhya.
So I feel like it's hard, and part of that's because I'm Asian American. It's hard for me to answer that question of who I am without talking about my parents, talking about my ancestors a little bit, right? Um, I was really lucky a year ago. My friends crowdfunded for me to be able to take a sabbatical from work and take my father's ashes back to India. So
Wow.
I'm an ordained Christian minister in the
Yeah.
Disciples of Christ. I have loved Jesus like my best friend since I was 3 years old. My relationship with Jesus is not complicated, and I grew up in an interfaith home.
Mm,
My father was Hindu. All of my family in India are Hindu,
mm,
and I was raised with a deep appreciation of other faiths. And my mother is is a Scottish Presbyterian, literally still has the accent Scottish, right? And so they were the cutest couple in the entire universe. So my friends raised this money to let me take my father's ashes back to India and for my family to get to participate in placing his ashes back in the Ganges. He wasn't like hyper religious. My mother thought it was a little over the top and kind of dramatic to do that because she wasn't sure he would have cared. Um, about that particular religious ritual, but she was really excited that his family, who had adopted her
mhm.
when her family had rejected her, that they would get to be a part of that ritual. The thing is, a lot of people who are immigrants to this country, I think the narrative is we come for a better life, and that's not untrue,
Mhm.
but also I think sometimes our families get pushed here
Mm,
because of all sorts of economic situations, because of patriarchy, because of war, because of all sorts of things, often that the first world created
right.
and exported to our homelands. And so my father loved this country so much. He loved
Mm,
his wife, he loved his life. Um, and whenever we were back in India, he would ask his nieces to sing two songs. One is Amar Shonar Bangla, which literally translates to My Beautiful Golden Bengal, the state that he
mm,
was from. And the other one, I don't know the title, but it translates to when I die, make sure to place my ashes back in Bengal so that when I am born again, I will be born on this soil.
Wow.
And so no matter what his religious beliefs were, there was something about that land that no matter how long he was gone, no matter how much he loved his life here, there was something in him that longed for that place. So I got to do that last year.
Yeah.
And then a month later, my mother joined me on the island that she was from in Scotland, and we spent an entire month there. It is 8 miles the whole way around. We walked, well, she's in her late 70s. We walked half the island. The only reason I was able to get her halfway around the island was because there was a cake shop on the other side of the island. So I would be like, if you walk this far, I will buy you a slice of cake. So we walked that island, and I heard all the stories of the hijinks that she got up to and the things that what life was like being one of the chambermaids at the one hotel on the island, and all of these great stories. And it's got me thinking a lot about what it means to have all of the privilege of getting to be in this country. And to deal with all of the pain of being constantly reminded of what it means to not be considered really from this country. And what it means to be connected to some soil that is 3,000 and 5,000 miles away.
Yeah.
I don't know if that resonates for you, because you and I both have that immigrant history, and that we are also American.
That's right.
Thing going on.
Yeah, that's right. I was born and raised in Newark, New Jersey. But I often would say, you know, while I was born in America, in the household, we were in Little Haiti. And, you know, I went to a Haitian church. But I've always kind of felt like, you know, I think a lot of first generation Americans whose parents are something else, or not born in America, we kind of feel displaced, right? I'm not American because my parents weren't born here, but I am American because I was born here. And when I go to Haiti, it's like, I'm one of you because my parents were born here, but I'm not really. Yeah, so there's always been that misplacement, right? Not feeling belonged. That the unsettling, right?
Yes.
But very much, I remember the first time I went to Haiti, soil meant a lot for me, right? Being able to connect with the ground.
Yes.
Being able to connect with the water, being able to connect with the dirt. You know, as you were talking, that's where I went back to, like, that meant a lot for me for some reason. Yeah. Yes. I'm curious, you mentioned that you were raised in an interfaith home. How has that shaped you?
I am really grateful for it, because I think it cultivated some empathy in me that was really important. So having grown up mostly in this country, we immigrated here when I was about 2.5. That meant that I was in a country that was majority Christian, Protestant. And the fact that and I grew up in the Midwest, where the fact that my father was Hindu was of great worry to some of my closest friends. It concerned them because they loved him and they could see what a lovely man he was. And it really, really frustrated them that he was going to spend an eternity in hell. And it concerned them greatly that I wasn't trying to save him. And there was something about that that didn't feel right to me. And I was really lucky, because my mother was really clear on the fact that she believed that was silly, right? She really believed that if we worshiped a God of love, then that God didn't have a lot of patience for sending people to hell who were as good and decent and kind and compassionate as my father. She just didn't buy it. And she worked really hard to convince me not to buy it as well. So I was really grateful for that. And what that meant is I had a weird bond with the Sikh, Sikh, and the Jewish kids in my school. In fact, one of my best friends in elementary school, we've stayed in touch. And to this day, she remembers that we were in Girl Scouts together. My mother was the co-leader of the Girl Scout troop, and a group of Christian girls got together and formed an exclusively Christian Girl Scout troop, which, just as an aside, is a violation of the Girl Scouts of America Code of Conduct. That's neither here nor there. Although I'm proud to be a Girl Scout, I'm proud of the fact that it's an interfaith organization. And I remember my friend feeling really sad about the fact that these people she loved had left to form their own thing that excluded her as a Jewish person.
Mm.
And my mother was so clear in a very forthright, brusque, very Scottish way. That's not the way of the Girl Scouts, and it's not the way of real Christians. This is a troop for all girls. That's the way it's supposed to be. And my friend said it made her feel loved and a little braver. And so I think being connected to a religious minority helped me recognize who to show up alongside. And what's really powerful about that is today, my friend, and at this point I'm going to say her name's Gail Altman Miller. She's an educator in Louisville, Kentucky. And she makes sure that all the kids in her school are learning about the freedom movement, that they are learning about racial equality, that they are learning about justice issues, because she got a taste of what it meant to be excluded and then to have someone show up for you. And her whole life now is doing the exact same thing. And I love that.
Yeah. You know, I think one of the things about white supremacy, the personality of white supremacy, is this idea that there is one way, one right way.
Yeah.
Right. And anything that looks differently from that, it's bad, it's evil, it's not good enough, right?
Yep.
This comparison thing, when the reality is that's not how the world works, right? That's not how the world, there is always this duality, right? There's always this multiple way of being, if that makes sense. And so I'm just wondering how your mom's culture, your dad's culture, and even religious beliefs, your relationships in your community, how you show up in the world, how it brought you to this work of racial justice. Like, can you locate one thing or experience that really shaped, right, or drove you, right, to this work of racial justice?
One thing. Well, tell you what.
It's not one thing.
Well, let's trade stories on that because I kind of want to hear yours as well. For me, the one thing that sticks out the most, actually, no, it kind of snuck up on me. I sometimes joke, every 4-year-old understands what's fair and what's not fair. And like around the age of 4, they get really, really invested in what's not fair. They get really invested in when people are lying and when they're telling the truth. I just never outgrew that phase. That's really a big part of what it is. So I was telling one of my best friends, about my roommates in college. So your first year of college, I was assigned a roommate. She was a lovely human being. We had nothing in common. And the second year, you get to choose your roommates. And so I was telling my friend about this, and I said, so it was bizarre because we just gravitated towards each other and built these friendships, and we moved in together our sophomore year. And it was just remarkable because coincidentally we were all mixed race. So I was, half Indian, half Scottish. Kim was half Black, half Chinese by way of Jamaica. I think that's an important factor. My friend Liz was half Chinese, half Japanese. My friend Jenny was half Japanese, half Puerto Rican. we were all mixed race. It was just a weird coincidence that we all found each other. And my friend Chris is like, Shonda, you really still think that was a coincidence? That was like 10 years ago. You thought that was a coincidence? I was like, yeah, it was just a random happenstance. We totally bonded. We also happened to all be mixed race. He's like, that was not a coincidence. And I was legit shocked by that information, right? Because to me, it just happened to be another thing we had in common. And he was like, it was never just another thing. It was the thing you had in common. And
Right.
there were also other things, like your politics, like your passion for
Right.
music, like your passion for food, all of the different things that we also had in common. And I think part of that is because we lived between worlds, right? And we had purchase in different spaces, and we had relative privilege and relative marginalization in different spaces, and we navigated our identities differently. But we all knew what it was like to be kind of accepted in some spaces and never fully accepted in any spaces, and having to translate ourselves to be heard, and all of those things. And we were good enough at it that many years later, one of my friends was sharing that it was frustrating to hear me identify as a person of color because everyone in our larger circle saw me as white. And some of that has to do with light skin privilege. I am very light skinned. Depending on the time of year, I am entirely white passing. And like you were saying, where we grow up, and the conversations we have with each other when no one from the dominant culture is listening, they don't know. They don't know what our lives were like. And we don't share those things because it's not always safe to. And so there was something about that cluster. And to be really clear, my friend who was saying that to me was warning me to be helpful, right? Was saying, don't keep acting like you experience oppression that you don't experience.
Right.
It is unfair to people who are dealing with a different kind of oppression.
Right.
So he was being helpful in his communication to me. But I think there was something about what drew us together across our differences that had a lot to do with not a lot of folks understood us, and it wasn't always safe to be our full selves in that institution that didn't want us to be our full selves, that wanted us to pretend to be what they were.
Right.
And so that created an intimacy among us that helped us survive what was actually a pretty toxic environment in a lot of ways, although I am incredibly grateful for my education.
Yeah. Yeah. Talk a little bit about light skin privilege. You mentioned that. And I don't think there's a lot of conversations around colorism. And to be honest with you, it's a conversation we have in-house, right? Because of the fear of using it against us. It's one of those painful in-house conversations you have with family. But what colorism is very much a representation how invasive racism is, right? I read somewhere that someone said colorism is racism's cousin, right? Same family. Yeah, so talk a little about light skin privilege, your experience with light skin privilege.
Yeah, so it's particularly interesting because this is where like frameworks of racism get complicated for me as a South Asian person, right? Because as far as I am aware, and I want to be clear, there are friends of mine who are experts on this and understand a lot more about it than I do. As I understand it, colorism in India predates colonialism. So it wasn't just something we were taught. It was something that colonizers exploited. And it was mixed in with the complexity of, and I want to be really clear, I want to show up in deep solidarity with my Muslim brothers and siblings who, and particularly in India, who are being horrifically mistreated by the current administration and by a lot of hooligans who are playing into a Hindu supremacist narrative. And unfortunately, part of that narrative is connected to the Muslims were our first colonizers.
Mhm.
And that's a weird narrative going back 600 years that I think is not fully accurate and definitely not helpful. That said, the fact that there were, for many years, people in power who were lighter skinned than indigenous born Indians might have played a role in colorism in our country,
Mhm.
um, in that country. And so colorism's a complicated thing in my fatherland already. And when you layer on top of the fact that we were colonized by white people who taught us to hate anything about ourselves that was dark. When I was in India last year, my family has the most lovely neighbors in the world, and they invited me over for lunch, and my auntie from next door showed up to walk me literally the 50 feet from our house to her house,
Mm.
and she showed up with an umbrella.
Mm.
And it was the summertime. It was 105 degrees. It was not raining.
Mm.
She showed up with an umbrella because she was worried I was getting too dark. That's how deep that runs.
Yeah.
And actually, her daughter, when she saw me, she was like, Shonda, I remember when you were such a nice light baby. What happened to you?
Yeah.
I'm the lightest skinned person in my family. And they're expressing deep, profound concern that I'm getting too brown.
Yeah.
Um, it's a real thing, and the amount of privilege I get because I am light skinned, potentially white passing, is a real thing,
Yeah.
and it's a real thing across cultures. I don't
Cross
know.
cultures.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I grew up in a Haitian household. Most of us in the house are dark skinned. So we didn't really have issues with colorism in the house, not from my perspective. Actually, I remember vividly have a memory of my sister. So one of my sisters, I have a lot of sisters, we got into it and we were physically fighting. We were young and she scratched my face, and my oldest sister reprimanded her and said to me, she's just jealous because you have beautiful skin. So some of my siblings had blemishes and some of us didn't. And I was one of the siblings who just had smooth, clear skin all my life. So I always kind of grew up with this idea that I have beautiful skin because I didn't have any scars or blemishes, right? My skin was always, very rarely do I wear makeup, don't need it, right? It was just one of those until I moved to the South. Now, I'm not saying colorism does not exist in the North, but when I moved to the South, and this was my mid-20s, I literally started to have kind of some self-esteem issues with my skin because how I was treated. And literally, I remember one of my mentors who would say to me, you are dark skinned, nappy, and loud. That scares people in the South. I'll never forget that. A Black man, right, who told me that scares people in the South. So it wasn't until the South when I realized being a dark skinned Black woman was a problem. And that was mid-20s. So I lived in a kind of fantasy world growing up thinking I had beautiful skin, right? Until I moved to the South and I was like, oh, this is a problem. And so literally I'm at a place now where I'm reclaiming, right? Shifting the internal narrative and reclaiming the kind of beauty, like beautiful self-imposed to myself that was robbed from me when I moved to the South. It was robbed from me. I did not think for a while that my skin was beautiful because other people had issues with my skin. So colorism is a very painful conversation because it's very personal for me. But at a place in my life now where having to reclaim and celebrate my skin tone and not wait for other people to do it.
Right. To recognize. So this is interesting because I feel like there's a couple things I want to reflect on there because Yeah, first off, I want to say I was just sharing a video with, I have the honor of teaching a class at Pacific School of Religion this summer, and I was sharing with the students in this class on social transformation of several videos of religious leaders exemplifying religion in the public square, which, because they are all progressive, inclusive, faithful people who want to do right, they're terrified of. The idea of public religion, they have only experienced as a negative thing. And so I was sharing with them videos of the water protectors, in the Native American water is life movement, the stopping the Keystone Pipeline. I shared with them a video about James Lawson and his bringing of the nonviolent movement into the lunch counter sit-ins in Nashville. I shared with them a video of a speech by Malcolm X. And he was talking about police brutality. And he was talking to a mixed religion audience, but an all Black audience. And he said, there are people who are going to tell you, because he was still in the nation, there are people who are going to tell you Elijah Muhammad is preaching hate. The next time you hear somebody tell you that, you ask them what kind of hate they are teaching that has taught us to hate our own skin. Who was it that taught you to hate your own body when God made that body beautiful and Black and perfect? And to me, it was just this profound moment of liberation theology, a Muslim liberation theology, that was about reminding the audience that self-hatred came from outside this community and had been imposed on them.
That's right.
And I really appreciated that, because I think racism isn't just race prejudice, as I understand it, as my denomination understands it, as sociologists understand it, as Beverly Tatum, who wrote Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, describes it, as Robin DiAngelo describes it in White Fragility. Race prejudice plus power. Race prejudice plus institutional and systemic power is what real racism is. There are a lot of people like me who are light-skinned, mixed race or not biracial the way I would identify, but who are light-skinned, who have our own journeys and our own pain that is real about not being accepted in white society fully, and certainly not accepted in white society when we confessed to who we actually are, and simultaneously being excluded from the community that we want to claim in certain ways, or being told that we're not enough, thing. But there's a difference between that and colorism. We may experience bias or discrimination, or we may not feel welcome fully. But when you add institutional power to the equation, that is different than the fact that friends of mine who have darker skin tone can't get access to the same jobs I can. It's not the same thing as not having access to the same resources, or being discriminated against in a court of law, or being treated differently for all of those reasons.
That's right. That's right.
And I think that's an important distinction. It does mean we need spaces to talk with each other about our personal pain. It's not that pain is unreal. It's very real, but it is not paired with power in the way that colorism is. And I think that's an important distinction to make.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's talk about your book.
Okay.
Yes. First, I want to know your journey to becoming an author. When did you know you wanted to write? When did you know you wanted to be an author?
So it's funny, I kind of backed into it. I think this is a weird thing that people don't know about extroverts. Introverts hear the word of God in a one-to-one conversation, a personal wrestling, the voice of the divine showing up, whatever it is. Extroverts only hear the divine's voice through other people. I kind of feel like in the Bible, when, I think my friend Jessica Vasquez Torres was the one that pointed out to me, when you hear God say it 3 times, that's how you know it's God.
Mm.
And I think the reason God speaks 3 times is to make sure the extroverts hear God, because we don't trust that it's a word from God unless we have heard it from 3 different people, right? Um, so I wanted to be a journalist when I was in high school and college, and then the ministry started calling to me. Actually, politics called to me first.
Wow.
So I had all this background in journalism. I had been the editor of the features section of my college paper. I was on that path. I went through a pretty traumatic experience my sophomore year of college that was kind of sensationalized in the media. I got a lot of exposure to sensationalism hungry journalists, and I decided I couldn't do that after all. I didn't have the stomach for chasing and exploiting people's pain. So not that that's what journalism is, it's just that had been my experience of it, and I backed away from it. So 7 years ago, when after sorry, I just blanked on his name. Trayvon Martin was murdered, and then his murderer was released while my denomination was gathered in Florida, in Orlando, where he had been released. It was a really profound, painful, but radicalizing in a good way experience for a lot of us in the Disciples of Christ, including the then head of the denomination, who cared about racial justice, but some of you, you encountered her probably in a very different way a couple of weeks ago than I had known her before the Orlando General Assembly. That was where she started showing up and talking about racism in very explicit, very public ways. And at that General Assembly, the head of Chalice Press said to the entire audience, "We are not doing right by you. We need to have more authors of color, and we need to have more authors talking about racism." And he reached out to me and he said, "You've been doing this work for a really long time. I think you have a story to tell that our church needs to hear." And that's where Pre-Post Racial America came from. I was almost finished writing it when Michael Brown was murdered. So the inspiration for it really was Trayvon Martin's murder and the anti-immigration backlash that was also emerging in those days. And so it references Michael Brown's murder, but largely because our publishing house was in St. Louis and they were like, "You can't ignore this." And Oakland wasn't going to ignore it. We had lost Oscar Grant. We were in solidarity with our family in St. Louis. Some of our best organizers went out to St. Louis to support the organizers on the ground there, like Alicia Garza, flew out there to do organizing trainings because she had a lot of experience from our work here in the years of fighting for justice for Oscar Grant. So that's where the book emerged from. I had stopped aspiring to being a writer at that point. I occasionally blogged, but it was really just to think through the work that I was doing as a trainer, honestly. It was Chalice Press and Brad Lyons specifically reaching out to me and saying, "I think the church needs to hear this story. I think you are one of the people who can tell it."
What I loved about reading the book was the storytelling perspective. And so there's synergy with the work we do at Scarritt Bennett Center, because one of our tenets with RJM is storytelling. And so each week when we host Zoom calls, we're intentional about inviting guests to tell their stories. Because I think, there's a TED Talk that talks about the danger of one story. You mentioned that.
Yes, Chimamanda Adichie, absolutely.
Right. The danger of one story. So let me hear more about your sentiments around the danger of telling one story and why you thought it was important to write a book that included voices that are often othered and not heard.
Yeah, so I love that you brought that up because actually the very first, I think the first quote in the book, or one of the first quotes in the book, is, and I learned this from that TED Talk, but she quotes the Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti, who says, if you want to dispossess a people,
Yeah.
simply start by telling their story and beginning with secondly.
Yeah.
And I think the point of that is there is power in many stories, and there is power when we don't fall into the one story is central and the rest are peripheral,
That's right.
but all stories are equally significant. Yeah.
I read that quote over and over again this weekend as I was preparing for this, because the power in that, starting with their story,
Yes.
right? And then secondly, right? So just expound a little bit more about why you thought that was such an important part of this project, right? The power of starting with one story,
Yeah.
one's own story.
Well, yes, exactly. And I started with my family's story because it's a story of multiple cultures.
Yeah.
You know what I would love to do to answer that, actually? And I don't tell this story very often, and it's not anywhere in the book, but the cover, I want to show, like, just briefly, I
Yes.
don't know if y'all can see, the cover of this book. I want to personally thank the Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Thompson, who is the senior pastor at Allen Temple Baptist Church, and I am so proud to claim her as a friend. One of, not the only, certainly, but one of the first Black women to head what I consider to be a mega church, one of the largest churches in Oakland. I was at a meeting at Allen Temple, and it was a gathering of Black clergy and Latinx clergy to discuss labor justice issues because those issues were affecting both of their communities.
Mm-hmm.
And if you'll forgive me for saying this, they were all dudes. They were super hardcore dudes. Some of my favorite clergy colleagues, they get into their like masculinity and they just are on a roll with it, right? And so one of my favorite Black pastors in Oakland, he was like, but the reason that we're struggling so hard is because the Latino workers work for so cheap and they're stealing our jobs. And one of my favorite Latino pastors said, the thing that my Black friends don't seem to understand is that because of our immigration status, we don't have access to the same resources that Black Americans have. And that's why we are struggling and are so desperate that we will take any job, no matter how little it pays. And so they're both saying things that are true. And I just very quietly, because I'm a girl and I can pretend to do I don't really understand things, but just to break up the masculinity, I said, I don't know if this is true, but this conversation leads me to feel like we are so deeply feeling the pain of our own communities that it is making it hard for us to hear the pain of each other's communities. And I wonder what it would feel like for us to listen to each other so that we can show up together against the people who are causing all of us pain. So after that meeting, Pastor Jackie came up to me. She was the associate pastor in those days. And she said, our youth at this church understand that. We need to be listening to the youth. And she took me and showed me the mural painted alongside the church, which is this mural, which was designed by the youth of Allen Temple Baptist Church, which is a Black church in East Oakland, and the youth of 67 Sueños, a Latino youth organization.
Wow.
And they drew a mural that illustrated their proud ancestors, which is over on this part of the mural, their shared suffering as youth without access to jobs who were affected by the criminal justice system or the mass incarceration system. And then the final part of the mural was how they were going to work together on their shared liberation.
Mm.
And I share that because sometimes we have a hard time listening to each other's stories, and it stops us from building the solidarity that we could build with each other. And wow, when our youth are given the space to do that, I've seen it with Palestinian and Israeli youth listening to each other's stories and struggles. I've seen it here in Oakland where Black and Latinx youth are building relationships, and also Black and low-income Asian youth. We don't really, the model minority myth convinces us there aren't low-income Asians. That's not true. Pakistani and Indian youth getting to build relationships with each other. Our youth are good at finally listening to each other's stories and then lifting each other up. I hope that we can learn from them in that process.
Yeah.
So that's why stories matter to me. How about you? What have you seen happen as a result of that being the methodology that y'all have embraced?
Yeah, so, as a womanist practitioner, experience has authority for me.
Yes.
And because the lived experiences and stories of Black women are often left out,
Yes.
right? Left out the civil rights movement, left out the woman feminist movement historically. And so for me, it's such a powerful tool to reclaim, right, what's been lost.
Yes.
And also to claim a kind of space that's not offered.
Right.
I also think storytelling helps us to debunk stereotypes, right?
Yes.
Storytelling invites people into a place that they probably have not been invited in, to a conversation, to be able to see, and I appreciate what you said, and to hear, right? And so it's been very helpful for us in our work at Scarritt Bennett Center because many of our audience members are invited to hear experiences and stories of folks that's real time. I think one of the biggest problems or biggest challenges right now with police brutality is we have sensationalized Black death. And so it becomes sort of a celebrity. George Floyd is now a celebrity, right, for the world, when in fact he's a victim.
We should be grieving
with that. So I think what we've done is we've kind of invited people into these intimate spaces to hear real people tell their stories. Because media sometimes take away the reality, the humanity of one's experience, right? It becomes sensationalized. And it's really just been a great experience for us where folks are invited to hear, to reflect, and also to engage. I think the other piece is, and this is white supremacy personality. If you're not talking about a particular group, they think they're not invited in. And so we like to invite people in, even though we're not talking about you. For example, this upcoming week, we're talking Black women's struggle, right? With racism and sexism, intersectionality. And there's a lot of people who might think, well, that's not about me, so maybe I won't tune in. It might not be about you. It's very much intentionally for Black women, about Black women, with Black women. But that doesn't mean you're not invited to hear.
Oh my gosh, and that's where the magic happens. Like,
that's where the magic,
What a time to be alive where we get to hear these stories that we normally wouldn't have access to, which is part of why I wrote Pre-Post Racial America in the first place, right? It was so we could eavesdrop on each other's stories and develop a little bit of understanding and empathy. I partly wrote it so that my white friends could meet my friends of color across all of their diversity. But I also wrote it because part of what drew me into anti-racism work was my heartbreak over how communities of color get pitted against each other because our struggles run so deep, and because more often than not, all of us feel like the other people of color don't care about what we're going through. And it creates walls. What happens if we start listening to each other's stories and recognizing the similarities and honoring the differences and learning how to be co-conspirators. I know we don't have time
and
to talk
showing
about
up
that
for
word,
one
do we?
another. Yeah. And showing
Yes,
up for one another, right?
exactly.
Imagine what could happen in this country and world
Yep.
if minority groups showed up for one another. Because
Yes.
oppression is oppression, right?
Yes.
Injustice
Yes.
anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Yes.
And not to get political, but we saw this with this administration. You know, the president has come for every minority group throughout his term as
Yep.
president. He has attacked every group. But imagine, like sometimes I just like to just imagine
Yes.
what it could look like
Oh my
if
gosh.
all of us just hand in hand show up. Could you imagine what it's like when Black Lives Matter show up at the gate, at, you know, these concentration camps?
Yes.
Children are still in cages.
Yes.
Literally.
Yes.
What,
and I feel like this is kind of the theme song from, well, the anthem of the Poor People's Campaign.
Yeah.
Somebody's hurting my sibling,
That's
and
right.
it's gone on far too long.
That's right.
And we won't be silent anymore. It is inviting us into showing up with each other. So I'm invited into a struggle where I'm showing up alongside an unemployed coal miner from West Virginia. On the surface, it doesn't look like we have anything in common, but I can show up for that in the same way that he can show up for to stop the 800% increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans, in the same way that we can both show up for the movement for Black lives. And so, yeah, the power that we have when we stop letting people pit us against each other.
Right.
And I do think where it starts
is
listening to each other's stories.
Yeah, stories
each
are
other's
very,
humanity.
very powerful too.
Yeah.
I think for this movement, for this moment,
Yes.
I think storytelling is definitely a powerful tool for this moment.
It is.
You mentioned it. Let's talk about co-conspirator. The other day, you put a quote up, and I was like, yes, that's what we're working with over the quote that said, if you come to help me,
yes,
go back home, but if you come because you recognize that your liberation is bonded to my liberation. I believe it was, who wrote that quote?
That's Lilla Watson. She's an Aboriginal activist from Australia.
Yes. So let's talk about co-conspirator. I am excited about this framework at Scarritt Bennett Center. It really has opened my eyes to see in a new way, right? Because most of the trainings, most of the conversation, the preparation that I have been a part of has always talked about white allyship. But always the narrative has been this idea that racism is my problem to fix, and you should reward all of the progressive, good white folks who come to help you fix your problem.
Who are being heroes. And so I think part of what I love about that Lilla Watson quote is she also takes on something else, which is, I don't want white people showing up because they think I am a pathetic thing in need of rescue.
Right.
And this is a little riskier to say, but I'm going to say it. White supremacy hurts white people. And I really want my white family to understand that and to recognize how important it is to them to work on dismantling white supremacy for the sake of their salvation.
That's right.
And we can show up for each other's liberation. Particularly what I love about that quote is it's also saying people of color are not just our suffering. People of color are not just our pain. We have wisdom to offer. We have navigated systems of oppression for years. We know how to build resilience. When COVID showed up and people started talking about mutual aid, people with disabilities, people from the LGBTQ community, communities of color said, we've been doing mutual aid. We've never bought into this myth that you can save yourself. We have the answers for this moment, right? And so actually this idea of, I don't need white allies, I first learned when I heard Roxane Gay speaking on a podcast that Kamau Bell and Hari Kondabolu used to do together. But she had written an article for Marie Claire just after Alton Sterling was murdered. And it was called On Making Black Lives Matter. And she said, allyship is a nice idea. It's a nice way forward for people to demonstrate that they care to help. But Black people don't need allies.
That's right.
And what she meant by that was, I don't want anyone showing up who can opt out. I don't want anyone showing up who can be a part of this and then not be a part of it, because we never get to opt out.
That's right.
I need people who know that their lives rely on being a part of this work. I need co-conspirators. I don't know if she used the phrase co-conspirators, but it's the one that I get the most excited about.
Yeah.
Black people do not need allies, and people of color do not need allies.
That's right.
We need people showing up on equal footing, on equal terms, with equal investment, and willing to take greater risk.
That's right.
Because of greater privilege.
That's right. Willing to take greater risk and willing to lay down your privilege and to pick it up and use it when necessary.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Pick it up and use it when necessary.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, absolutely. Share with us one of the stories in your book that stands out to you.
You know, it's funny because I feel like a lot of people have their favorite story from this book. And I was flipping through it today because it's been 5 years since it came out. And to, you know, in my defense, I am actually launching a course based on this book in September because I think that the materials are still relevant and useful.
Right.
And so I feel like there are a number of things in it that have been useful to people over the years. And I think the one that I have never once heard anyone talk about that is my favorite, because it's complicated, is the chapter called We Are Each Other's, and victims is crossed out and the word siblings is put in its place.
Yeah.
And I think the reason I love that chapter is because it's what we were talking about. It's an in-house conversation. It's about how in certain spaces where people of color have relative privilege, how they might wield it against each other.
Yeah.
And how we can transcend that.
Yeah.
And partly it's my favorite chapter because I wrote it about my former co-pastor, Tyam Reespan Wilson, who was one of the sweetest men ever to walk the face of this earth and also one of the most radical. And he was so deeply committed to supporting the children of Oakland that he worked as an after-school coordinator in predominantly Latino schools. And his compassion gravitated towards the Southeast Asian kids in the school because they were the most likely to be bullied because they didn't speak Spanish, because they were from a different cultural group. And there was something in me that was like, oh, you can do that. And there was something about his relationship, his friendship with the Latinx school coordinator who had brought him on board, and how they had this shared vision for creating a better world for the next generation of Oakland youth that I hold dear to me and think about all the time.
Yeah. So pre-post, I'm trying to remember this title, pre-post Racial America 5 years. But you just released a new book. Tell us about this new book.
I did.
Yeah.
This is the book that you need to be able to get through pre-post Racial America. It's called Liberating Love, 365 Love Notes from God. It came out yesterday, available also from Chalice Press. I will never publish with anyone except for Chalice Press because I never have to worry that they're going to publish someone who's theologically offensive to me. I'm really grateful for the work that they do. So Liberating Love is just a collection of devotions that are meant to encourage, inspire, and strengthen us in the midst of very trying days.
Yeah.
I wrote it for activists who are on the front lines and need the reminder that God loves them so
Yeah.
much for what they're doing. I wrote it for parents who are struggling to raise compassionate children and needed that word of support. I wrote it for my ex-evangelical friends who are used to a practice of daily spirituality, but can't find a resource for them
Yeah.
that honors that God loves LGBT folks and loves immigrants and thinks Black is beautiful.
Mhm.
And so that's who the
It's like a
devotional
love
is for.
story from God.
It is.
A love letter from
It
God.
is. It
Yeah.
totally is. Every
Yeah.
single day. Yeah.
Yes. And I know that you're having those who've contributed in the book to actually go live and to read. So share a little bit
Yes.
about that.
Oh my gosh, it's so fun. So I took all the devotions I wrote in August, and I reached out to all of my favorite religious leaders. Some of them are immigration justice activists, and some of them are just great preachers, and some of them are BLM movement activists. And every day at 10 o'clock Pacific, on the Liberating Love Devotional Facebook page, there is a Facebook Live event where they just read the scripture and the love note from God every single day in August.
I love that. I was
It's
able
so
to
fun.
tune in. I think it was yesterday. Yeah, the first one, right?
Yesterday, well, I've been doing them since August 1st, but yesterday,
Oh,
Pastor Kamal did
yeah.
one on launch day. That man is a saint. I love him so much.
Yes. I'm looking at the time.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
I'm so excited. I know it just happened so fast. But I want you to share from your heart for those who are watching and who will watch this video. Share about this hour. We are living in strange times where there's just so much unknowns and unrest. But what I loved about the stories you told about your mom and dad, how love was the foundation. So, in spite of difference, right, it was this
Yeah.
love that they had for one another, this force of love that was able to overcome the challenges that came with being different.
Yeah.
Right. And so share from your heart for those who are watching who might need a love letter from God or a reminder that while we are in these unknown times, this is really just unknown times, the power of love still has the ability to keep us. For those who are on the front lines doing justice work in so many different arenas, who are tired, who
Yeah.
might feel that all of the work that they've put in, right, is going on deaf ears. Share with those who are watching from your heart a word from the Lord.
I think there's an awful lot of us who feel like our labor, I don't know if we feel it's in vain, but it definitely goes unnoticed. And, you hear about the heroes of the movement, and you never hear about the sheroes. Um, and I find myself thinking that for the next generation of activists, I'm not worried that they won't hear about Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or Mahatma Gandhi or any of those folks, but I love getting to tell them about Ella Baker.
Mm.
And the reason I mention that is because Ella Baker was a profoundly gifted woman, but she was also committed to being humble. And she was committed to making sure that no matter whether she agreed or disagreed with the youth leading the movement, she always listened to them and she always loved them. And the reason I talk more and more about Ella Baker these days is because that's what's going to transform the world. The big, profound, verbose, fancy worded folks aren't the future of the movement. Grateful for them, lots of words of inspiration that have gotten me through because of them. But the future of this movement is tender. The future of this movement is a movement where we get to experience our needs getting met and our gifts being honored, and where we get to hold and encourage and support each other. we get to live a little bit of the world that we're trying to create. And I'm so excited to get to be in that world with this generation of movement leaders, with my elders who have embodied that. I'm thinking particularly of one of the most radical movement leaders I know in the Disciples, Catherine Hargrove, who is also always an auntie, as well as being a radical movement leader. And I'm thinking about the youth who don't put up with a political space that doesn't also extend compassion for their full humanity, and who keep showing up for each other's humanity. How blessed are we to live in a moment where God's vision is coming to fruition in that particular way.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Sandhya Jha, we want to thank you so much for being with us tonight. Pre-Post Racial America, Spiritual Stories from the Front Line. We will be providing that link all month long. And I think it's also important for us to also share the good news about Liberating Love, Daily Devotion, 365 Love Notes from God. And so we'll be promoting both of those books all month long. We want to encourage you, as you are always searching, I hope, are searching for resources, what to read. There are women of color who are writing. There are women of color who have the kind of wisdom and knowledge, insight that you need to hear from. And so this month, all month long of August, we want to introduce to you Sandhya Jha and her work. And so as you build yourself up to become a co-conspirator, I don't think you can do it without hearing from this beloved servant of God. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, sharing on this platform. You, all of who you are and what you do, we need you. You are so necessary. And I believe God is pleased. I believe that God smiles on you because you are definitely doing what God had intended in mind when God created you. So thank you. Thank you for your yes to God and to humanity. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Again, please join us again this upcoming Sunday at 2 p.m. Central as we have an intimate conversation with Black women about the Black woman's struggle, racism and sexism, the intersectionality. And so we want to, again, thank you for joining us and have a great evening. Bye-bye.